Why is Arcane so good? Is it because it's the best performing mage spec at this moment? That plays a part into it, of course. It could also be the insane burst it is capable of that many people like, and the fact that the tier set is really fun and works both in single target and AoE. Let's check it out. There can never be a positive discussion about the spec without Joe, Flavor of the Month Johnson, commenting about how Arcane isn't being invited in 28, or how if you're not the literal best DPS spec out of the whole 39 available, you are bad. Well, I am obviously not a main Arcane that does 28s or a main of any kind that does 28s at all yet, but Arcane is definitely able to clear Giga keys. The footage you are looking at is of a plus 28 key, and it will only get higher than this. As far as meta is concerned, it's hard to call anything good outside of 5 specs that just do the highest key level and always will be meta, while everything else will not. The concept of meta is so specific and narrow that people use it to justify their gaming experience and what they actually play, and for the life of me, I don't really get why. Unless they're like actually pushing to be number 1, rank 1, 1% top of the world, and that's when it should only matter. And at the end of the day, this only matters for those people. And honestly, we talk so much about meta and whether or not you should care about it, that it becomes a stale and boring topic. To be fair, there's quite a bit that can be said about meta and what it means, what the World of Warcraft meta is, and if you should care about it, that we can also make a whole video about it. I mean, if you're interested in watching that video, get this one to something like 2,000 likes and we will get right on in making it. Because usually videos on abstract topics like these don't do that well on the channel, even though we like making them. And for that we have our Patreon platform that supports our content and eventually makes it easier for us to do videos people want to see, even if YouTube doesn't push them to a wider audience. If you want to be a part of the team and support our content, head on over to patreon.com/MarcelianOnline and check it out. You will also be able to get some goodies along the way, like 4K wallpapers with your character's transmog, early access to some of the videos, bloopers, and more stuff like that. Plus, of course, our undying gratitude for the support. No, really appreciate it. Now let's get back to our Arcane businesses. Looking generally at logs, Arcane is definitely the best performing mage spec in the raid, however poorly mage is doing nowadays, and it's not that bad, it's not that poorly. And since this will definitely get people to take this way too seriously and consider Arcane bad, here are the current logs on Mythic Farok, and notice that out of all of the specs in the game that could bring the smackdown, Arcane is here, and about 75% of the other DPS specs are not. And on top of that, Echo used Gingy on Arcane for their world first Farok kill, and Liquid had I'm Fired Up also play Arcane on their Farok kill. These are all top-end players, the best of the best, but that's what signifies what meta is, or at least where meta begins. So Arcane is meta, we established it. Can we move on now to what makes this spec actually good? Because just being meta is not enough, and it's also a boring discussion to have. There is a stigma on Arcane of it being the hardest spec in the game to play, or at least one of the hardest specs in the game. Difficulty is, first of all, subjective. To someone like I'm Fired Up, I am sure Arcane is easier than the spec he played the least of, and definitely easier than it would be for me and you. So objectively, difficulty is a relative term to approach, but we can still have as close to an objective opinion about the spec by just looking at what it has to deal with. Just as a point of reference, we can take Balance Druid as a comparison. A relatively simple spec with a few plays to juggle, but something most people can play and only a few actually perform with it. This strikes a good balance between high-end gameplay and accessibility. Its rotation is rather straightforward. We can take its rotation from the Wowhead guide to paint a picture of what you need to remember. Now, put Arcane side by side and you can probably see a difference. Not sure if all specs have this thick of a rotation segment, but holy walnuts, is this some perspective. And to the more attentive of you, you may have noticed this little thing, this insignificant flavor text, the fine print of the arcane rotation, if you will. Notice how it is not checked. As if it was, the rotation would be populated with more lines of text to further explain what you gotta do as Arcane. I showed you this mostly as a meme, but it is funny to compare how these two specs play so differently, even though their general performance is similar. But all of this doesn't matter. In the end, the spec is designed for anybody to play it and have fun. Whether or not they play it at 100% potential is a different discussion, since that can be said about any spec or any video game or anything in life really. And these mediums are not populated by just the elite, so it's fine if you want to pick up the spec and enjoy it. And enjoy you will, since the spec is actually fun. And to give you a bit of relief, the AoE rotation is actually a lot simpler. You can think of Balanced Druid and imagine it's around that level of difficulty. You basically spam about 3 abilities outside the 2 to 3 cooldowns you use regularly. It's actually kind of fun to do it since you aren't relying on RNG, being stationary, or any mechanic that can make things annoying for you. On bosses, particularly in Mythic Plus and raids, you still have to squeeze a bit of mechanical prowess. But people have pointed something out in our hardest specs to play video to their credit. The muscle memory you build while playing this spec, although true for all specs by the way, will make the rotation significantly easier over time. I'm saying this again in case you were, for whatever reason, still discouraged to give it a try. And realistically, at the end of the day, World of Warcraft is not a particularly difficult game to play, so you should be fine with whatever you want to do, even if sometimes you have to put in a bit of work. For all of its complexity, Arcane actually doesn't have a lot of builds for you to learn to play. There's the standard raid single target build that does most of the same things, with the addition of the mana gem. This will give you the most amount of boss damage you can hope for in most if not all of the raid fights currently. There's of course an option for some extra cleave if you are inclined to do so. There are a few boss fights where cleave is important for certain adds, although these adds can have an increased kill priority, like Laradar, where they need to die so you don't wipe. Usually have a lot of specs that naturally cleave without losing boss damage or having to swap builds. This gives you the flexibility of choosing which build to go for, or if changing anything is even necessary. I am saying this since I know there are people who loathe having multiple builds, which is fair, but also people who like variety and flexibility, like myself, having about 6 raid builds for different bosses. Last but not least, there is the M+ build, which takes 1 extra AoE talent from the raid cleave build and plays almost exactly the same. So yeah, the spec has a bit of a learning curve, but the good news is that you will be able to take those lessons to all of the content without having to relearn anything new. Once you actually pick it up, you are reminded that you are indeed a mage, in case that was not obvious at any point in time. The playstyle and fantasy of the spec do indeed do it justice. This is not to say that the other 2 mage specs don't also do the same, but it's sufficient to point out that there have been expansions and patches where you might not have felt like a proper mage before. Also, with the mini talent rework Mage got a while back, your actual mage kit has drastically improved, especially with the talents like Ice Cold and Mass Barrier. Ice Cold in particular gives you a much needed flexibility to your defensive kit, something I'm sure a lot of other classes would love to have. Mass Barrier gives you some much needed group utility that brings the Archmage fantasy finally into WoW. All we need now is Mass Teleport or Mass Blink. Take your party on a ride, you know? Evokers can already do this with their rescue abilities anyway. But really, one of the most magey thing I loved doing was the double time warp. Dude, this feels so badass to know you get double the haste, double the lust, double what everyone else is getting. Makes you feel like a Giga Chad. Plus, I mean, you know, so much freaking haste is amazing, dude. Couple this with your burst window, and I don't know how Fire Mage feels about it, but you explode. Not me. I don't even have my tier set yet, but still playing it for the video was very fun. It's been a while since Arcane was better than the other two specs. Even though Fire likes M+ keys a bit more than Arcane, it's still nice to bring the breath of fresh air and not just see fire or frost all over the place. Not to throw shade on the other two specs, because even if Mage is not at the top of the charts at the moment, it's still doing really good. And for the rest of the meta-analysis, click our range tier list video we did for Mythic Plus. It paints a better picture for Mage as a class, but also for Arcane. Not going to spoil it anymore, since what's the fun in that? Just click it and enjoy.